Good morning. My name is Janice Blake. I worked my whole career as a freelance writer and editor. Over all those years, in fact, throughout my whole life, I would always listen to the stories of my Uncle Joe. I always knew that these stories would make a great book, and now I'm in the process of compiling all of that into a book. I'm going to call it Lighter Than Air, the 20s, the 30s, A Marriage Made in Heaven, and the War. In our family, when the topic of conversation was World War II, my Uncle Joe would always say, "There are a million stories out there. This one is his." Joe Flynn served in the United States Navy from August 1940 until August 1946, and so he was on active duty for the duration of World War II. His story is important not because he did anything extraordinarily heroic, but because he didn't. Joe was one of the more than 15.5 million Americans who served in the United States Armed Forces during World War II and survived. What's so impressive about Joe and all those we now call the greatest generation was their incredible sense of duty, their commitment, their willingness to make whatever sacrifices were required. My guess is that all those who served probably had the same attitude as Joe. He would die if he had to, but he'd rather stay alive. Joe's story illustrates the reality that whether a man lived or died was purely the luck of the draw. Joe was a combatant in the longest-running campaign of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic. It took the lives of more than 72,000 sailors and merchant mariners and saw the loss of more than 3,500 merchant vessels and 175 warships. And every time a ship went down, the crew would be blown to bits, drowned, left swimming for their lives, often through burning oil, or huddled in lifeboats with no guarantee they would ever reach shore. Although not as well remembered as many others, the fact is, if this battle had not been won, D-Day and the liberation of Europe would have been impossible. Joe said he joined the Navy because he was sick of making a buck here, a buck there, and the last buck he earned had been made cleaning up the cemetery for Memorial Day. He was 25 years old, he knew the draft was coming, and he had heard so much about the trenches of World War I that he wanted to avoid the Army. He figured in the Navy he'd have a bunk to sleep in, hot meals, and no mud. While still in high school, Joe had spent 2 summers at Citizens Military Training Camp. The CMTC program was established when Congress passed the National Defense Act in 1920. Young men between the ages of 17 and 24 could volunteer to receive basic military training. Those who participated for 4 summers could apply for reserve officers training and a college education paid for. As it turned out, Joe's father would not give him permission to go back for a 3rd summer, because by then, Joe had a job at the A&P grocery store. It was the height of the Depression, and Pa thought Joe's dreams of college were impractical. Because of his CMTC experience, Joe arrived at boot camp already knowing what the rest of the new recruits were about to learn. He made such a good impression that he was kept on for a whole extra session of basic training, not as a recruit, but to help the instructors run drills for the next group coming in. The Navy was speeding men through basic in fewer weeks. They wanted to man ships as fast as they were building them. Joe's first posting in November of 1941 was to USS Wichita. He said when he got to the pier at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and saw the size of this huge battle cruiser, that was when he knew he was really in the Navy. Once aboard, he was assigned to Division B, boilers. Wichita had 4 fire rooms with 2 boilers in each. Joe's job was fireman, snipe in Navy lingo, responsible for operating one of those 8 boilers. These photos from Battleship New Jersey show a fire room very similar to the ones on Wichita. The fireman's job was to constantly adjust burners and blowers to make sure the flames inside the boiler were blue or bluish white. Orange or yellow flames would send dark smoke up through the stacks, and this was a big no-no. Smoke that could be seen from beyond the horizon put the ship and the men on it at risk. When Joe first came aboard, Wichita had a peacetime crew, 600 or 700 men. For waging war, the ship would need over 900. Joe noticed that at every port, more sailors would come aboard. It was obvious. They were building up the complement. They were getting ready for war. In December of 1940, after several stops to take on more men, Wichita arrived at Norfolk Naval Station and went out on maneuvers constantly. They would take groups of Naval Reserve midshipmen out to the southern drill grounds off the Virginia Capes for gunnery practice. Joe described the process. One of our ships would tow some old tub out there, a worn-out vessel ready for the scrapyard, and all the ships participating in the practice would take turns shooting at it. Eventually, they'd sink it, and a big cheer would go up. Of course, the men in the boiler room saw none of this. The first time word came down from the bridge that shooting was about to commence, the chief engineer barked, "Stand by, this is our turn on the target. They're going to fire the big guns, so watch out for flarebacks." Luckily for Joe, he had been reading the manual. He knew what was going to happen and took a giant step back from the boiler. The guy on the boiler next to Joe obviously had not read the manual. When the flames shot out at him, he was scared to death. He leaped backwards, but not soon enough. His eyebrows, eyelashes, and hair were all singed. He did not make that mistake again. In January of 1941, the Navy put an admiral aboard, and Wichita headed south. There were weeks of maneuvers in the Caribbean, including practice landings, putting assault parties on the beaches of Puerto Rico. After a few months of this, they headed north. The men were told they would be participating in the neutrality patrol. They were to radio back to shore the positions of any ships from combatant countries in U.S. waters. This tipped off the British to the whereabouts of any German ships on the move. The Germans, of course, could also find out where the British ships were, but this information was useless to them. There would be no point chasing down a British warship with the U.S. Navy nearby. The German Navy had strict orders to steer clear of any ship flying the Stars and Stripes. Hitler did not want to get involved in war with the United States until he had secured his stranglehold on Europe. At this point, Britain was fighting on alone. The tons of supplies being shipped in from across the Atlantic were crucial to its survival and its ability to keep waging war. The Nazis were determined to intercept and sink as many supply ships as they could. The British Navy organized convoys, but never had enough escort vessels to prevent an alarming number of sinkings. In May of 1941, the British managed to sink the magnificent battleship Bismarck, newly launched and pride of the German Navy. Horrified, Hitler ordered his biggest and best surface ships to stay in port, safe. After that, Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the Nazi U-boat fleet, would be responsible for sinking the freighters and tankers heading for Britain, destroying as much tonnage as possible. The United States was supposed to be neutral, but on a day the bosun's pipes signaled general quarters, all hands to battle stations, Joe saw that this was not the case. His battle station was midship repair on the main deck inside. The sea was rough. All the hatches were battened down. Joe was curious. Why battle stations? Was this a drill? He looked around, didn't see any officers, so he spun the wheel on the nearest hatch, opened it, and stuck his head out. Freighters. They were escorting freighters. What if one of them was torpedoed? Getting involved would be an act of war. Joe was alarmed. But after a while, the all clear sounded, and the men could stand down. Later, coming off his watch in the fire room, Joe decided to go out on deck and look around. He counted 17 big merchant ships and 2 other Navy cruisers, the Tuscaloosa and the Vincennes. They told us we were just patrolling and we were neutral, Joe would tell us. But in fact, we were helping the Royal Navy. We were escorting a convoy headed for Britain. Once Wichita reached Canadian waters, the Canadian Navy took over and escorted the convoy the rest of the way. Joe wondered if the men would be given any explanation. Back in New York, he found out. Before Wichita's sailors were allowed to go ashore, they were told, "Listen, you guys, when you get over onto the beach, you tell nobody where you've been or what you've seen." Within days of tying up at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Wichita was placed in dry dock for a major overhaul, and the crew was put to work scraping the hull. Then one morning, a call went out for volunteers to transfer to a ship called Hawaiian Packet. Joe was one of the first to raise his hand. It sounded like a ship with no guns. But when he and the others got off the ship and down to the oil shack for their paperwork, they were handed orders that made no mention of Hawaii or a packet. Instead, report to USS Seattle for transfer to USS Redwood. As they all milled around in confusion, one guy turned out to know what was going on. USS Seattle and USS Camden, 2 World War I vessels, both berthed in the Navy Yard, were used for bunking sailors in transit. The Redwood was being built in Ohio, and the shipyard was out on strike. Until that ship was ready to move, they'd be assigned to various work parties and going nowhere. Their first project was on Pier 92, the Italian pier. The Italians had been evicted, and the Navy had taken over the space. It would be converted to a huge receiving station. Planners knew that soon Seattle and Camden, which were brought alongside, would need all that additional capacity for the number of sailors transferring in and out of New York. Joe and the others set to work, ripping down posters of Mussolini, dragging benches out of the waiting room, and setting up their own cots. After that, they were given bags of raw asbestos and told to mix it with water and paint it onto the giant doors in the Congo area for insulation. For the next 4 months, it was one work party after another. And when he had liberty, Joe would spend all his free time with his girl, Rosemary Bartels, who lived in Astoria. In mid-October, orders finally came. The Redwood crew were to travel to the American Shipbuilding Company's yard in Lorain, Ohio, on Lake Erie, and bring the new ship out to the Atlantic via the St. Lawrence Seaway. From there, they would make their way down the U.S. East Coast and on to San Juan, Puerto Rico. USS Redwood, just 162 feet long, with a displacement of 700 tons, looked like a toy to the men who had come off the 600-foot-long and 10,000-ton Wichita. Everything about this ship was different, including its diesel-electric engine, which meant Joe would no longer be a fireman, but an electrician's mate. After a couple of shakedown cruises, Redwood headed for Lake Ontario, from there into the Welland Canal and on to the St. Lawrence. It was sobering to see that Montreal, Quebec, and every community along the river was blacked out at night. Canada, part of the British Commonwealth, had already been at war for more than 2 years. Once out on the Atlantic, Redwood headed for Halifax, Nova Scotia, to lay over for the night. As they waited outside the harbor, sailors on Redwood noticed that the pilot boat coming to guide them in was approaching unusually fast. Once alongside, the pilot leaped onto the ship's ladder and ran up the rungs, shouting, "Make a hard left rudder. You are over a minefield." A minefield. The next morning, Redwood's crew had a second reminder that they were in a war zone when they came upon the wreckage of a ship that had gone down not too long before. No signs of life. and not much doubt there was at least one sub nearby watching. It was a relief to know that the U.S. flag waving from the fantail was keeping them safe. But all too soon, that sense of safety would be gone. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. They were tied up in Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, where Redwood would be fitted out with gear that was installed by the Navy, not by the shipbuilders. Sound gear, radar, even a washing machine. Joe had been on his bunk napping when one of the guys shook him, shouting the news. In an instant, fully awake, Joe was up the ladder and into the messing compartment, where a bunch of guys were crowded around the radio, including the skipper. "Captain," Joe said to him, "we're at war." The captain nodded. Joe knew, the men all knew. Their armament consisted of one .50 caliber artillery piece and 4 machine guns. They had not yet been issued any ammunition. The men just milled around for a while, listening to the same news over and over. Finally, word came. They were to go out and patrol a designated quadrant of the ocean. Orders were, if you see anything, ram it. Ram it. They all knew what that meant. Their small ship would be gone before the war even started, and so would they. With luck, they would survive the night, and the nights to come. There was no choice now but to follow orders and hope for the best. So they bummed some ammo from a couple of subs and headed out to sea. By the time they got to their station, night had fallen. It was dark. Nobody knew what to expect. Did Hitler have tie-ins with Japan? Were the Germans going to attack our coast? As it turned out, there wasn't a single German ship in American waters on that night. But in those first hours, immediately after the shock of Pearl Harbor, there was no way to know this. Joe was on watch in the engine room when the bridge called down, "We need a man to stand by the searchlight." The chief said, "Hey, Joe, go on up." Of course, this was winter, December, but Redwood had been headed for the Caribbean, so the men hadn't been issued any heavy winter coats. Being a New Englander, Joe knew what to expect. He went to his locker and grabbed everything he had. He put on a sweater over his work shirt, a pair of uniform pants over his dungarees, his pea coat, his watch cap, then up to the searchlight platform. And there was Sam Farrar, on lookout. By now it was snowing. Snowing, cold, windy. It was turning into a really wild night. So there they stood, Sam Farrar and Joe. Sam was supposed to be scanning the horizon for anything that looked like it might be a ship. Joe was supposed to wait until Sam saw something, then put the searchlight on it. But Sam didn't even have a pair of binoculars. And even if he did, there was nothing to be seen but blackness and swirling snow. Visibility was just about zero. Joe thought about his decision to join the Navy. The hot meal and bunk wouldn't do him much good if his ship went down. He had thought volunteering off his ship with big guns was a good idea. But whether he was in the boiler room of Wichita or the engine room of Redwood didn't matter much. U-boats always targeted a ship's power plant, below deck, amidships. He was still on the part of the ship that had the bullseye on it. Within days, Redwood was heading south and straight into the opening salvo of Germany's initial naval attack in U.S. waters. Once Hitler declared war on the United States, Admiral Donitz was ready. He sent 5 long-range submarines stocked with as much food and as many torpedoes as could be crammed aboard from the U-boat pens at Lorient, France. Their first strike in U.S. waters were to be on the same day, January 12, 1942. Donitz called it Paukenschlag, or Operation Drumbeat. It lasted from January to August of 1942 and resulted in the loss of 609 ships, with tonnage totaling 3.1 million. At first, U.S. response was almost non-existent. The Navy was simply unprepared for anti-submarine warfare. Not enough ships, patrol planes, or personnel to staff them. No strategy in place, no blackouts, no convoy system. Merchant ships in American waters continued to steam independently, as they always had. They stayed close to shore, knowing submarines couldn't maneuver in shallow water. But that didn't protect them. At night, it just made them easier to see, silhouetted against the glow of lights on shore. And they were picked off like targets in an arcade game. Coastal resorts like Miami and Atlantic City complained that blackouts would be bad for business. It took quite a while for the Navy to overrule them and to organize protective convoys. Fortunately, though, the Navy had planned ahead for harbor protection, ordering 32 Allo-class net-laying ships. One of them was USS Redwood, assigned to the 10th Naval District, the Caribbean. The Caribbean was a lot more important strategically than people realized, and its waters were soon thick with U-boats. All cargoes from South America or brought through the Panama Canal had to traverse the Caribbean. Petroleum from Venezuela went to refineries on Curaçao and Aruba. These supplied 70% of the fuel for Allied planes. Bauxite, just about the only raw material the United States had to import, was the main source of aluminum and essential for airplane production. It came from British and Dutch Guiana and was stockpiled at a huge terminal on St. Thomas and then shipped north. Port of Spain, Trinidad, the biggest harbor in the islands, eventually became the assembly point for convoys going north. The biggest net Redwood ever installed was across that harbor. It was 7 miles wide. Before we started installing nets, Joe told us, U-boats were going right into the harbors and sinking ships while they were being loaded. The nets kept the U-boats out of harbors, but didn't stop them. They would sit and wait, a few miles out, along busy sea lanes, and then attack. Wolf packs, they were called, because they hunted like wolves, 2 or more teaming up to destroy their targeted victims. Redwood came under attack more than once. The first time, the crew went to battle stations. Joe was in the engine room. Afterwards, the sailor on the wheel described what had happened. The captain, looking through his binoculars, could see the wake of the approaching torpedo. "Here it comes," he said. His words were relayed throughout the ship. There was a terrible, long silence. What would happen? Would they get hit? Would they go down? Then the old man walked across the bridge, lifted his binoculars to his eyes. "There it goes!" A huge cheer went up. That torpedo had gone right under them. Later, when they pulled into port, the navigator of a Navy sub that had followed them in told their executive officer, "I was surprised when I came topside and saw your size. You sound like a freighter." That was when we knew, Joe said, that we had a chance. When U-boats were submerged, they couldn't see their targets, but they could hear them. They set torpedo depths based on the size of the ship they were aiming for. Because Redwood was built with the extra power necessary to drag heavy nets through water, she sounded like a much bigger vessel than she actually was. From island to island, Redwood plied the Caribbean. In port, the guys who Joe said weren't too smart got into the kind of hot water that he made it a point to avoid. But those shenanigans are a story for another day. Always, the main event was Redwood's net tending, work that was redirected only once. One day, the men were sent ashore on the island of Yaquis, just east of Puerto Rico, with instructions to bring their sea bags. Given gloves and machetes, they spent a day harvesting pineapples on a plantation. One of many, that had been taken over by the Navy to make way for a massive firing range. Then back to net tending. The onslaught of U-boat attacks went on for months. After the Allies landed in North Africa in November of 1942, the pace lessened as Donitz redeployed many of his subs to the Straits of Gibraltar. Toward the end of February of 1943, after more than a solid year of intense and heavy work, Redwood was ordered to Charleston for an overhaul and installation of the gear they hadn't had time to wait for back in Portsmouth, including, finally, a washing machine. Joe, who had earned 16 days' liberty, wasted no time in calling Rosemary and catching the first train to New York. Back in August, he had proposed in a letter, "If and when I get back to New York, let's get married." She had replied, "That's a good idea." He arrived at Penn Station the morning of March 1st, and 2 days later they were married. After the wedding, they headed to South Weymouth. Joe wanted to see his family. He also wanted to see the air base the Navy had built in the woods and fields that abutted their neighborhood. Letters from home had often included pictures. The street that ran by their side yard was now paved and had cement sidewalks. What had always been just a dirt road now led to the base's main gate, less than half a mile away. Blimps overhead were a daily occurrence. So once he and Rosemary had done all their visiting, Joe put on his uniform and walked down to the gate of the South Weymouth Naval Air Station. Being a sailor on active duty, he was allowed onto the base and proceeded to walk around. He couldn't believe the size of the place, the paved roads, the runways, the barracks, the administration buildings, and 2 massive hangars. One was supposed to be the biggest structure of its kind in the world. He didn't doubt it. All this in place of the pig farm way back in the woods, the trees he and his buddies used to climb, the bushes of wild blueberries they had picked when they wanted to earn dimes to go to the movies. All of it gone. Blimps were tied down on hard stands, their noses tethered to mooring masts. Joe wandered into one of the hangars where a sailor, who had obviously glanced at the patch on his sleeve, told him, "Hey, you're an electrician's mate. You can request lighter-than-air training." On his way back to the house, Joe thought about that possibility. Lighter-than-air duty would mean work on dry land. No more dodging German U-boats. After talking this over with Rosemary, he filled out an application, and 4 months later found himself at Lakehurst, New Jersey Naval Air Station. He had been reassigned to Blimp Hedron No. 1. Like everything else needed to win the war, the lighter-than-air service had been built up fast. When the war started, the Navy had only 6 blimps capable of long-range patrolling. By the summer of 1943, there were 10 bases in the United States and overseas bases in South America, the Caribbean, and Europe. Unlike airplanes, blimps could hover in place. With crew members continuously scanning all 4 compass points, they had a 360-degree view. Radar and magnetic scanners enabled them to detect surface vessels up to 90 miles away, as well as nearby subs in shallow water. And they could stay in the air for many hours using very little fuel. U-boats hated blimps. With blimps in the sky above, they could not surface, and they needed to surface to recharge their batteries and their oxygen supply. Although each airship was armed with depth charges and a .50 caliber machine gun, blimps were never intended to be attack vessels. Their value was as a deterrent. Able to match the speed of ships below, they made ideal convoy escorts. They also patrolled for downed pilots and survivors of sinkings. Although Joe qualified as a lighter-than-air sailor, he was not assigned to a flight crew, but to the maintenance shop in Lakehurst Big Hangar, and to ground crews as needed. He was trained in the servicing and repair of the engines and everything else electric on the blimp. He said changing light bulbs in the running lights on top of the airship from a bosun's chair rigged to the rafters of the hangar was about as dangerous as his job got, until the day of a very bad ice storm. He was added to a ground crew that needed an extra man. A blimp out of South Weymouth was in trouble. It was the only one left in the sky. All the others had been grounded by a fast-moving northeast storm. This one was caught at sea, and Lakehurst was the closest airfield. Buffeted by freezing rain and sleet, the airship was weighted down by ice. Ordinarily, when a ship comes in to land, a blimp kills both its engines. But the pilot didn't do this. He knew that if the crew wasn't able to pull him in on the first pass, he would have to circle around and try again. He must have figured that if he was too heavy to get back up without a boost from the engines, he'd be in the drink. What Joe didn't realize when he headed out to the landing pad was that standard rigging at South Weymouth was not the same as Lakehurst. Instead of 4 separate straight lines, ships out of Weymouth used only 2 looped lines, one at the bow of the ship and one at the stern. As the blimp came in, the men on the ground struggled to secure its lines, but the wind was knocking the ship around, and it got away from them. As the blimp lurched forward, the looped stern line caught Joe at the back of his knees and dragged him up. By a fortunate miracle, he slid the length of the line and slammed into its cable hook, which released, or broke. Either way, the blimp was still low enough that he wasn't killed when he landed. The doctor said it was a wonder he had no broken bones. The back of his head and knees were badly cut up, and he had a severe concussion. But he was alive. Not too many weeks later, back at the maintenance shop, an officer stomped in, demanding of the chief electrician, "Who's your best man?" The fact that Flynn was supposed to be on light duty did not dissuade the officer from rounding Joe up, along with several others, to be transferred to England. Back at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, awaiting transport overseas, Joe decided to volunteer for shore patrol rather than get stuck on a work party. He was sent to guard a giant ship model set up in Rockefeller Center. It was to be the centerpiece for a major bond drive event. "All I had to do was stand there and look smart," he said. And that's where Joe Flynn was when he heard the roar of a cheering crowd in Times Square and knew the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. 3 months later, Japan would do the same. But it would be a full year before Joe's 6-year hitch was over. In August of 1946, while getting his discharge papers, Joe met a fella he had gone through basic training with. He told Joe that all the guys who went through boot camp with them had been sent to the Pacific. A lot of them didn't make it back. Ever after, Joe would say, "Someone up there must have been looking out for me." In figuring out the context and chronology of Joe's war stories, one of the resources I tracked down was the cruise book of USS Wichita. I was curious to see just how differently things might have turned out if Joe hadn't raised his hand to volunteer for the non-existent Hawaiian packet. What I found out? By war's end, Wichita had earned 13 battle stars and lost only 3 men: a gunner, an able seaman, and a fireman. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about my Uncle Joe or the Battle of the Atlantic. Thank you.
How are things?
Very, very good, thanks.
I saw you back in, was it early February, late January, when there was lots of smoke across Los Angeles and
Oh, yes.
things seemed very apocalyptic indeed, didn't they?
They did. Still a little bit apocalyptic, but we try to stay optimistic.
So I know that you've written, this is your second book that you've written
Yes.
about World War II.
Yes.
why apart from the obvious, which is that you have uncles that were in World War II, why are you so fascinated and so fascinated that you would write about it? What is it about World War II that's so special for you?
It's the men. It's those men. I mean, I grew up, the stories that you just heard are stories basically that I grew up hearing so frequently that I had them almost memorized, but I did record them. So I just felt this Uncle Joe and my mother's other three brothers all served. They were quite remarkable characters. The first book I did was not a relative, but a man I had worked with. And I had worked with him so much that he and his daughter, who were both graphic designers, became friends of mine. He requested that book just before he died. And so that was the beginning of my retirement career as a writer of books about the men who served World War II. Also, I think, Alex, although the generals made history with their leadership, it was these men who made history possible. And every single story was fascinating. Um, Uncle Joe used to say there are a million stories out there, which of course there are.
Um, can I ask you a little bit more about the Battle of the Atlantic because I thought
Yes.
your presentation was great in terms of giving us various tastes of the war. It was the longest continuous campaign of World War II. It was actually, as Churchill famously said, it was the one battle that kept him up at night. It was the single thing in World War II, if you can imagine this, that worried him most. Can you tell us a little bit about what you came to understand about this longest and most critical of campaigns in World War II?
Well, what I came to understand is that Britain was standing alone. Britain needed the supplies coming across the Atlantic, and also not just the Atlantic, but from all its colonies in order to stay supplied to keep on fighting. And the Germans were determined to defeat Britain since they couldn't win with the Blitz and they couldn't figure out how to make an invasion. They didn't have the kind of navy that the Royal Navy had. Um, they would have to starve Britain out, and to do that, they they launched the submarines. Now Hitler was kind of afraid of Navy. He was real confident in tanks. Donitz asked him for many more submarines, and he said, "I can win this war with more submarines." But Hitler wouldn't give him all the submarines he needed, and that was lucky for the Allies. It was lucky for the world. The battles, if you will call them that, weren't really battles. They were attacks, and those submarines could sneak up on a convoy and be invisible and then come up and start sinking ships. And although there were a few escort vessels, they were never adequate. There was no real way to catch the submarines. And the convoys would poke along, and the escorts would try to chase down the submarines or scare them away, and they would come up right in the middle of convoys and destroy ships. I could go on and on. One of the most horrifying things that I read about was that if you were in a great big convoy and your ship was gone, you were not going to get rescued because everyone is commanded you cannot stop. If you stop and try to pick up survivors, you'll get hit. It's a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, it's one that my grandfather was a part of. My grandfather, my mother's father, was in the British Navy. 51,000 members of the British Navy lost their lives in World War II, as compared rather to 36,950 from the United States. And my grandfather joined up right after the beginning of the the Second World War. That was the 3rd of September 1939, and he died of his wounds, complications from his wounds in 1944. So he served from September 1939 through the worst days of the Battle of the Atlantic. The tide turned in the Battle of the Atlantic in May of 1943 when we actually started to sink more and more submarines. There was a famous period, May of 1943, called Black May, when we really, really devastated the Kriegsmarine in the Atlantic. But I think that it's worth pointing out that often those who served in the Battle of the Atlantic have been overlooked and many of them obviously forgotten. And it's important that we have at the World War II Memorial, the only national World War II memorial in the United States, we actually have a signifier for the Battle of the Atlantic.
Yes.
I take high school students there and others, they look at it and go, hang on a second, what's the Battle of the Atlantic? Which I can't believe that people would ask that question. What's the Battle of the Atlantic? But unfortunately, we have to answer it. And you've done a very good job in your presentation. I have to come on to a question now. Um, what do you think the enduring lessons are from World War II that you would pass on to other people? What do you think today that we need to remember most about people like your uncles?
I think what's most important about those men is their value system, really, their sense of doing what they could to basically to help others. I've heard many people, and I've listened to many of the presentations here that you've had, which have been wonderful, saying that people of other countries were amazed that the American GIs, sailors, and all who served were willing to sacrifice and fight so hard to save other people. And that, I think, was the ultimate moment for all of world history when we saw that the best we could do was to help each other. I just saw that ideal in my uncles, in Nat Bell and Tony, whom I also wrote about, and all the dads in my neighborhood.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Milton, Massachusetts, just south of Boston, and we were in a little, neighborhood post-war, maybe, small houses, and it seemed like in every house there was a photograph of the father in his uniform, like on the mantelpiece or sitting on top of the console TV. Lots of, I don't know. I just thought everybody was in the war as a kid growing up, the 50s.
Did you see that any evidence that they suffered from what we call now PTSD? Did you see any evidence of the damage that had been done to those who served and came home? Did you ever see any of that?
It was very well hidden. I didn't see it in my father didn't serve. He was a little older and he ended up not serving. But my Uncle Joe is the one I spent the most time with. He was very obviously very valuable because of what I've told here this morning is basically I'm retelling his story in his words. My Uncle John, however, who was in the army in the battles in Italy that we all followed in the steps of, he was very quiet. And my Uncle Phil, who had been a ball turret gunner in a B-17, he was even more quiet. And these men, in my mind, sorting it out, it wasn't just a matter of personality. I think the difference was Joe had not been required to kill anybody, and the others had. And I think it haunted them. It haunted them for the rest of their lives. Friends tell of a father. One good friend of mine had a father who served in the tank battalion, the 111th, I believe it was. They liberated not only making it through the war in a tank, but liberating a concentration camp. And this man lived into his 90s, and she said he would wake up screaming. My cousins tell me of Uncle Phil later in life being very despondent And she's, Carol would say to him, what's wrong, Dad? And he said, I'm thinking of all the people we must have killed. They were all haunted.
Ju- can we talk a little bit more about this because it's something that we don't often enough touch on? Uh, the price paid by those people who actually saw the sharp end. It was interesting in my case that, you know, the people that talked most about the war after they came home were usually the ones that did least. And those
Yeah.
who'd seen most, I had been traumatized by it, didn't want to talk about it. Can you explain to people because so often people say, "Why didn't my grandfather, why didn't my father talk to me about the war?" That's a question that I get almost every time I speak publicly. What's your answer to that question? Why didn't they speak about it?
My answer to that is that they came home heroes. They were celebrated as heroes. They, I think they carried their sense of duty forward to suppress the grief they felt and the pain they felt and the nightmares were hidden, and they went forward. They wanted to resume life. They got married, they raised families, they were wonderful husbands, they were wonderful fathers, but they were haunted, and they just they just suppressed it as best they could. I didn't find out until, oh, I was pretty my uncle, one of my uncles who was well into beyond middle age, I found out had a drinking problem that was well hidden. It was, what do we call that? Self-medicating. Um, they they were dutiful men, and they thought part of their duty was to just keep going and suppress the pain that they had. But there were enough of them, unlike say the Vietnam War, where they were vilified and not treated with respect. They were treated with such respect that they didn't see a way of saying, wait a minute, that was just terrible. They just said, well, we're proud of what we did, which they were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the great movies about World War II is the best years of their lives. You've obviously seen that, the post-war movie that really kind of dispels this myth of the happy, proud warrior returning to a blissful America. There was an awful lot of alcoholism. There was wife beating. There was a lot of dysfunction because these people had been terribly damaged.
Yes, for
Um,
sure.
I, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this because we're about to come up to the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. It's worth stressing that 19 million European civilians were dead by now 80 years ago. That's 19 million civilians killed in Europe by this time in World War II. And if you look at the reaction to the end of the war among those who actually fought it, not the civilians partying in Times Square and Trafalgar Square, but the actual warriors, I call them warriors, even people like Eisenhower, they were not overjoyed at the end of the war. They were just
No.
exhausted. They were
Yes.
absolutely exhausted. Their adrenaline started to drop off. And there was a very different attitude, even in the moment of victory, toward the war than there has been mythologized since, if you see what I'm saying.
Yes. Yes. Alex, when Saving Private Ryan came out, and everybody was very excited about it, I knew that obviously my Uncle John had been in the infantry and had fought in three horrific campaigns and had earned three Bronze Stars, which we didn't know until his granddaughter announced it at his funeral. We were together, and there was a poster, and I said, Uncle John, are you going to see that movie? And he just looked at me uh, very grimly, and he said, I don't need to see that movie. I already know what's going to happen. I said, what's going to happen, Uncle John? That guy there, and he pointed to the picture of Tom Hanks with his two lieutenant stripes on his helmet. He's going to get killed. He said, they always shot the officers first.
Yeah, and actually, in some cases, if you were an arrogant young second lieutenant straight out of West Point or wherever, and you thought you knew what you were doing on a battlefield in the European theater, and you started bossing people around without any experience, they would conveniently forget to tell you to take off the markings on your uniform, and you would last maybe a few hours.
Right.
That happened too. Um, so we're coming up to the 80th anniversary now of the end of the war in Europe. Given that there are so few people left alive to talk about what happened to them, to be honest about it, what do you think our mission is, not just for friends, but others too, in terms of remembering World War II? What do we need to remember about it more and more?
I think we need to remember that war is not the solution, that the damage done is never worth the price, and that the politicians that send people to war need to improve their way of problem solving. My mother, whose four brothers, obviously, these are the four I'm talking about, was so bitter. Her father died in 1944, probably of the anxiety worrying about his sons. She would say, let the politicians, send their own sons or let them go. But she was very bitter about it. War just isn't, it's, it's, is not going to solve anything in the end, and is going to impose just terrible price on the people on the ground and on those men who and women who fight it.
Yep, I agree with you up to a point, because I think that if you were enslaved by Nazism, then the World War II and the
Oh,
arrival of Americans was an important and good thing. But
I yes, well, that's the great conundrum. So what you have to go back through time and rewrite history, because Nazism never would have happened if the attitude at the end of World War I had been different and not so punishing. We humans have a lot to learn.
yeah, it's a good discussion. I wanted to say, Janice, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all your work, and thank you especially for supporting us so well. You've been amazing. Um, our next guest is Susan Eisenhower, and I hope everybody will rejoin us in about 5 minutes. But going to your point, Janice, these are words from the Allied Supreme Commander, a man who saw more than his fair share of the cost of war. And after World War II, he said this: every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. That's Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower after victory in World War II. Worth remembering those words.
So that's the answer to your question.
Well, I kind of conveniently found it. It was just here.
Thank you.
I hope to see you again soon, Janice. I
Yes,
hope to
thank
come
you
on one
so
of
much, Alex.
another of our journeys, and thanks so much for a great story. It was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.